Hey everybody, for next week you're reading, I think, two chapters of what I think is a really fantastic book. It's called The Strange Career of Henry Ellis, and I already like the title because it's kind of, you don't get interesting titles like that often in history books. And I'm going to talk about Henry Ellis and who he was and why he was interesting. But I just wanted to remind you that in addition to showing you the techniques of writing history, one of the reasons I want you to read these two chapters is the author of the book, Carl Jacoby, is coming to UTSA on March 8th. And if you can come to one of his presentations, and I'll talk about them more, you'll get extra credit. Now, if you can't come on that Thursday because you have a job or family responsibilities or class, there'll be other extra credit opportunities, so don't feel like you're getting slighted here. But I do want to encourage those of you that can come to come, because I think this is really a rare opportunity. Carl Jacoby is a nationally and internationally renowned historian. He's also a very nice guy. And the other cool thing about this presentation is that Henry Ellis's grandson, a man by the name of Chip Williams, who is a teacher now in the Los Angeles area, a high school teacher, he's coming as well. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of background on the two chapters that you're reading. I'll give you kind of a brief introduction, and then I'll go into it a little bit more in a little bit more detail. Henry Ellis was a man, a Texan, African American, born in Victoria in 1864, born a slave. Grew up in Victoria, grew up in South Texas, was light-skinned because we think either his mother or grandmother had been sexually assaulted by a white, which, as we know from reading Jacobs, happened all the time. Was light-skinned, grew up in Victoria, learned how to speak Spanish fluently, grew to understand the culture of South Texas and even Mexico, and then ultimately, for the rest of his life, passed himself as Mexican, Mexican-American, sometimes a Cuban, and sometimes a Hawaiian. So a very interesting guy, and I think maybe what makes him even more interesting is that he became a millionaire. He ended up living in Mexico, became a prominent figure in Mexico City. He also opened an office on Wall Street in New York City. You're not going to read about that in this section. And ultimately, he becomes the U.S. envoy to Ethiopia. He kind of has a boom and bust life. He's an entrepreneur. He makes money, he loses money. And then he dies in like the 19 teens, and he's pretty broke when he dies. So that's the story, the general story, and I'll go over it in more detail in this series of podcasts that I'm recording this morning. Now, one of the things that I want to get across to you, and which I think is important, is how did someone like Jacoby come across this man? The thing about Ellis is that he wants to keep his identity secret. He wants to keep his identity as an African American secret, and so he's a little bit hard to trace. We don't have many records on Ellis. We don't have many words or anything of the sort on Ellis, and so we don't really know. It's hard to find out about him. And here's how this journey started for Carl. When he was a graduate student at Yale, he went to Yale for grad school. His advisor, Carl wanted to do something on the border. And, that's one of the things we might want to ask him. Why does someone from the East Coast care about the Texas-Mexican border? It's kind of very interesting. I actually don't even have an answer. And so his advisor at the time said, why don't you look at U.S. State Department documents and just look around and see if anything jumps up at you. And so that's what Carl did. He was a very good student. He started reading documents from the State Department pertaining to Texas and Mexico when, as he later put it, Henry Ellis introduced himself to him through the record. And what Carl discovered is that in 1895, a Mexican businessman, or a businessman passing himself off as Mexican, was trying to bring African American sharecroppers from Alabama to work in Mexican plantations. He wanted to bring a couple of hundred African Americans from Alabama into Mexico. Now, this was very unusual, and it caught Carl's eye because you usually think of immigration going from Mexico to the United States. So that was a little bit odd, but then when Carl thought about it, it made a lot more sense because 1895, this is right in the period where Jim Crow is taking hold in the U.S. South. The Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision that legalized the idea of separate but equal. The Supreme Court handed down that decision in 1896, so just a year later. So for African Americans, Mexico seems to hold some promise because Mexico did not have the formal segregation than did the United States. Now, as it turns out, Mexico turned out to be a lot more complicated place for African Americans than they had hoped. In this failure, even though these farmers, these African American farmers from Alabama, did go to Mexico, it didn't really work for them, and most of them ended up coming back to the United States. But the context of it is interesting because what you have is a group of African Americans looking for a way out. And the person that's trying to help them is an African American who's passing himself off as Mexican, who's passing himself off as a Mexican businessman. So for Carl, this was just a really fascinating discovery. But it was very hard to piece together the story of Henry Ellis. So what he did was he kind of put it aside. He's written a couple of very, very important books, one on a massacre of Indians in the Southwest called Shadows at Dawn. But the story of this guy Henry Ellis always gnawed at Carl. And another thing you should know about Henry Ellis, that when he decided to pass himself off as Mexican, he changed his name. He changed his name to Guillermo Enrique Eliseo. So he's changed his name as well. So he's living kind of this secret life. And it took Carl a while to kind of find out the information on him so he could write this book. And some of the book is kind of speculative because Carl can build a context in which Ellis worked, but we don't have the exact record. We don't have a diary or anything like that. Now, this is the first of a couple of podcasts. The last thing I want to say about the podcast is, in this podcast is, Carr was so successful in kind of integrating himself into the lives of Ellis's descendants that last spring he actually went to a wedding in Mexico where a descendant of Henry Ellis got married. Ellis had a couple of families, one in San Antonio and one in Mexico. And so Carl got to be friends with the Mexican side of the Ellis family, and I think it really says a lot about him and the trust that he was able to develop with the descendants of Henry Ellis.